That doesn't mean the war ended on May 5th. What it means is that the initial, most intense phase of joint U.S.-Israeli strikes gave way to a longer, lower intensity, but still lethal phase, one punctuated by diplomatic efforts running in parallel with continued military action. Delegations from the United States and Iran entered negotiations, and in June, both sides signed onto a 14-point memorandum of understanding, brokered with Pakistani involvement and signed in Islamabad, laying out a framework for a war-ending deal. It's worth being precise about what that memorandum was and wasn't. It wasn't a peace treaty, it was a roadmap, with a 60-day clock attached, meant to move both sides toward a final settlement while reducing the immediate violence. For a few weeks in June, that framework appeared to be holding. On June 18th, the United States lifted its naval blockade of Iranian waters. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz rebounded. A day later, a separate ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah took hold in Lebanon, suggesting the broader regional fire was, if not extinguished, at least banked. But the underlying disputes that started the war, Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile arsenal, its network of regional proxy forces, and now, on top of all of that, a leadership succession crisis inside Iran itself, were never resolved by the memorandum. They were deferred. And deferred disputes in an active war zone have a way of reigniting. They reignited in early July. Iranian forces struck a vessel near the Strait of Hormuz, and that single incident was enough to restart a full American strike campaign that has now run, night after night, for nearly 2 weeks straight without interruption. On July 12th, U.S. officials confirmed a new round of strikes on Iranian air defense systems and IRGC fast boats operating around the strait, explicitly framed as an effort to protect commercial shipping. Iranian state media reported that a strike on an agricultural water pumping station in Mashhad killed the facility's guard and injured several others. A detail that underscores how much of the reported damage on the Iranian side, this time around, has centered on infrastructure adjacent to military sites rather than purely military targets themselves, at least according to Iranian reporting, which international outlets have generally been unable to independently verify, given the access restrictions inside the country. By the time CENTCOM reached its 7th consecutive night of strikes in mid-July, the target list had visibly expanded. Iranian media circulated images of a bridge in the port city of Bandar Kamir, reportedly destroyed by U.S. strikes, part of a broader campaign that had, by that point, hit ports, bridges, airports, and military facilities across Iran's southern provinces. Inside Iran, a debate was reportedly sharpening between hardliners pushing for continued confrontation and more moderate voices arguing that renewed war was exacting a cost the country could no longer sustain, a debate playing out even as Iran's own chief negotiator continued, at least publicly, to defend a dual approach of diplomacy backed by military readiness. The night of July 15th into July 16th marked a further escalation in the character of the strikes, not just their frequency. For the first time in that particular window of the campaign, CENTCOM's targeting explicitly emphasized command centers, the actual coordination nodes where Iranian commanders receive intelligence, issue orders, and manage the flow of the war, rather than only the outer perimeter of coastal radar and small boats. That shift matters strategically in a way that's worth spelling out plainly. A military campaign that hits missile launchers and radar sites degrades what a country can physically fire. A campaign that hits command centers degrades a country's ability to decide what to fire, when to fire it, and how to calibrate a response that stays below some threshold of uncontrollable escalation. Destroying the tools of coordination doesn't just reduce capacity, it introduces the possibility of decisions being made by disconnected local commanders and proxy groups acting without central direction, which tends to make a conflict less predictable, not more contained. That same week, Iran released Dana Kari, an American citizen who had reportedly been detained in the country, and Iranian officials framed the release as a goodwill gesture. It's a pattern that shows up in a lot of protracted asymmetric conflicts. A state facing sustained military pressure will often pair visible acts of conciliation with continued, sometimes intensified, military resistance. It keeps a diplomatic door open through intermediaries, in this case, reportedly including Oman, while simultaneously signaling to a domestic and regional audience that the government has not simply capitulated. Iran's foreign ministry, even while authorizing that release, continued to insist there were no active plans for negotiations, and Iranian officials reiterated that the Strait of Hormuz would remain closed to what they described as hostile shipping until the United States complied with what they characterized as the strait's proper legal framework. By the 9th consecutive night of strikes on July 19th, the pattern had become close to routine, and that routine was starting to generate secondary crises across the region. The IRGC claimed it had struck 2 tankers attempting to transit the southern route of the strait near Omani waters, a claim international outlets were not able to independently confirm, but one that true or not, had the intended effect of reminding shippers and insurers that the strait remained genuinely contested. On the same day, Iran launched missiles toward the Jordanian city of Aqaba, close enough to Israeli territory to draw a direct Israeli military response. Jordan's air defenses intercepted several of the missiles, with at least one landing in a remote area of the country. Israel's military leadership stated it remained ready to resume full combat operations against anyone who targeted the country. The U.S. Embassy in Bahrain, meanwhile, issued a warning to American citizens that Iran might be preparing to strike locations in central Manama, urging vigilance without specifying further detail. By the 13th night, on July 23rd, the campaign had widened even further. CENTCOM's strikes that evening targeted, once again, command centers, but now explicitly added drone storage facilities to the stated target set, a sign that the campaign has moved from degrading what Iran can coordinate to degrading what Iran can physically produce and launch on short notice. Iranian state media reported at least 4 people killed that night. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed, through Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency, that the United States had resumed flying B-1 long-range bomber missions out of RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom, a claim that international outlets, again, could not independently verify in full, though at least one American outlet reported separately that a B-1 had in fact been used against IRGC targets earlier that week. Whatever the precise aircraft mix, the reappearance of a forward operating base in the UK for American strategic bombers is itself a signal. Sorties of that range and payload are not aimed at fast boats near the coastline. They're aimed at hardened, distant, high-value targets, and a bomber flying from Britain rather than a regional base changes the geopolitics of where American power is being staged from, which is part of why an Iranian parliamentary security official responded that week by directly threatening the joint U.S.-UK base at Diego Garcia, warning, in a public post, that the base's days were numbered, comparing it pointedly to the fate of past colonial holdings. The war's ripple effects on the wider region and on global energy markets have become impossible to separate from the strikes themselves at this point. On the same day as the 13th night of strikes, oil prices crossed $100 a barrel, a level markets hadn't touched consistently since the earliest, most acute phase of the war back in the spring. Iraq shut down every crude oil loading terminal in the country after a drone struck a tanker near its main export complex. No group claimed responsibility, but the timing, in the middle of an already tense week of strait closures and tanker incidents, was hard to read as coincidental. That single Iraqi export hub handles the bulk of the country's daily crude exports and ranks as one of OPEC's largest single loading points, so taking it offline, even briefly, has consequences for global supply that extend well past Iraq's own borders. Around the same time, Houthi forces in Yemen escalated their own campaign in the Red Sea, adding a second maritime choke point to a list that already included the Strait of Hormuz, a reminder that this conflict, even though it centers on the United States and Iran, has never been contained to a bilateral fight. It runs through a network of aligned and opposed actors across the entire region: Iraq, the Gulf states, Israel, Lebanon, Yemen, and beyond. Diplomatically, the war has also produced some genuinely unusual byproducts. In the same week as the 13th night of strikes, the United States signed a 30-year civil nuclear cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia, one that, according to U.S. media reporting, includes a uranium enrichment facility on Saudi soil to be operated by American companies. That detail matters because it represents a meaningful shift in long-standing U.S. nonproliferation policy, agreed to in the middle of a war that, at its outset, was explicitly justified by concerns over Iranian uranium enrichment. Critics of the deal have pointed out the apparent tension in that timing. Supporters frame it as locking a key regional partner into American-controlled nuclear infrastructure, rather than leaving Saudi Arabia to develop independent capability, or to seek help from Russia or China instead. Either way, it's the kind of decision that only makes sense in the context of a war that has scrambled a lot of the region's prior assumptions about who its future nuclear players will be. The United Kingdom has taken its own distinct legal step in response to the conflict. In mid-July, the IRGC was formally designated as a proscribed organization under new UK national security legislation, placing it in the same legal category as several other groups the British government treats as direct state-linked threats. Under that designation, it became a criminal offence in the UK to express support for the IRGC, or to provide it with material assistance, with potential prison sentences running into double digits for the most serious violations. That's a significant step for a Western government to take against a foreign state's own military and paramilitary organization. Historically, sanctions and asset freezes have been the more common tool. Formal prescription alongside groups treated as terrorist organizations is a different, heavier instrument, and it reflects how far the diplomatic relationship between Iran and Western governments has deteriorated since February. At the United Nations, the tone from the Secretary General has grown correspondingly stark. Briefing the Security Council in the same week, the UN Secretary General described the situation as teetering on the edge of the unimaginable, language that, from an office generally cautious about dramatic phrasing, signals real alarm about where the trajectory of the conflict is heading. Saudi Arabia, for its part, asked the Security Council to formally condemn the Houthi attacks on commercial tankers and to hold what it called their Iranian sponsors accountable, adding another thread of pressure aimed squarely at Tehran's proxy network rather than at the Iranian state directly. It's worth stepping back at this point and asking what all of these individual data points add up to, because, taken one at a time, they can look like an unconnected list of headlines. A strike here, a tanker incident there, a diplomatic agreement somewhere else. But there is a coherent pattern underneath them, and it's one that shows up in a lot of protracted asymmetric conflicts once an initial decapitation campaign has run its course. Iran, since at least the June memorandum, has been running something close to a dual-track approach, pursuing limited diplomatic openings, through Oman, through prisoner releases, through its own negotiators' public statements defending diplomacy, while simultaneously continuing military pressure, through direct strikes, tanker seizures, and a wide network of regional proxy forces. That combination lets a government under pressure keep multiple options open at once. It can de-escalate quickly if a deal materializes, and it can continue to demonstrate resolve to hardliners at home and allies abroad if it doesn't. The problem with that strategy, and it's a problem that has become increasingly visible over the past 2 weeks, is that it depends on functioning central coordination. A government running a dual-track strategy needs to be able to calibrate its military actions precisely enough that they read as pressure rather than as an unrecoverable escalation, while its diplomats work a parallel channel toward a deal. That calibration requires the exact infrastructure that CENTCOM's strikes have increasingly targeted. Command centers, communication networks, the nodes that connect political decision-makers to the forces acting in their name. When that infrastructure degrades, the risk isn't just that a country loses offensive capability, it's that the remaining capability becomes harder to control. Missile salvos become less coordinated. Proxy groups in Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon may act on their own initiative rather than under clear direction from Tehran, especially in a period when Iran's own leadership has already been through one violent succession crisis this year. Under those conditions, the line between a calibrated deterrent strike and an escalation nobody intended to trigger gets thinner every week the campaign continues. There's also a human and economic toll running underneath all of this that's easy to lose in a discussion of targeting patterns and strategic logic. Casualty figures from the Iranian side, drawn primarily from Iranian state media and generally impossible for international outlets to verify independently, given restricted access, have accumulated steadily through nearly 5 months of intermittent and, more recently, nightly strikes. On the American and Allied side, U.S. officials have confirmed at least one American service member killed and another wounded during the current phase of strikes, a reminder that despite the campaign's heavy reliance on standoff weapons designed to keep American personnel out of direct contact, this remains a war with a cost measured in American lives as well as Iranian ones. Regional displacement, disrupted oil exports, and the broader economic strain across Gulf states and beyond add another layer that doesn't show up in a nightly strike tally but shapes how sustainable this conflict is for everyone involved, including the publics in the countries doing the fighting. None of this has unfolded in a domestic vacuum, either inside the countries doing the fighting or beyond them. The February strikes and the killing of a sitting head of state, however that leader is regarded, triggered protests opposing the war in a number of countries within days, a reflection of how uneasy a decapitation strike against a nuclear-armed adjacent state's top leadership sat with significant parts of the international public, even among people who had no sympathy for the Iranian government's record. That unease has persisted through the months since, running alongside, not replacing, the strategic and military debate over whether the campaign is achieving its stated aims. It's a reminder that a war measured in nightly strike totals and barrels of oil is also, simultaneously, a war being watched and argued about by ordinary people in dozens of countries who have no formal say in how it proceeds. It's also worth being precise about what Iran's response has actually meant in practice across this war, because the phrase tends to get used as shorthand for a single, centrally directed military machine, when the reality is considerably more diffuse. Since long before this war began, Iran's regional strategy has relied heavily on a network of aligned armed groups across several countries, rather than on direct engagement by its own conventional forces alone. Shia paramilitary groups in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi movement in Yemen, and various armed factions elsewhere in the region, all of which have, at different points and with varying degrees of central coordination, acted in ways that serve Tehran's broader strategic interests. That network took serious losses in the years before this war even started, particularly during the fighting that followed the October 2023 outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war, when Israel moved aggressively against Hamas and Hezbollah's leadership specifically. Iran entered its war with Israel, and the United States in February already operating with a visibly weakened proxy structure compared to a few years earlier, which is one reason a number of analysts have pointed to as evidence of just how exposed Tehran's regional position had become by the time the opening strikes hit. The Houthi escalation in the Red Sea in July and the Iraqi paramilitary landscape's continued instability both trace back to that same weakened but still active network rather than to any single, centrally issued order, which loops back to the earlier point about command and control degradation. The harder it becomes for Tehran to direct its own network precisely, the more that network's actions start to look independent, opportunistic, and harder for anyone, including Iran's own leadership, to fully predict or control. It's worth comparing the shape of this war to the one that preceded it, because the contrast tells you something about how much has changed in less than a year. The 12-day war of June 2025 was short, sharp, and narrowly scoped, aimed almost entirely at nuclear infrastructure and the people who ran it, and it ended in a ceasefire within less than 2 weeks. The current war has already run more than 20 times as long, has killed a sitting head of state, has forced a leadership succession inside Iran under wartime conditions, and has expanded its target set well beyond nuclear facilities into the broader machinery of the Iranian state. Its command structure, its communications, its coastal defenses, its drone production. That's not a difference of degree. It's a difference of kind. A war aimed at slowing a weapons program is a fundamentally different undertaking than a war aimed at degrading a government's ability to function. And the length of this current campaign is, in part, a direct consequence of that broader and more ambitious goal. The fragility introduced by Khamenei's death and the rushed succession that followed also deserves more attention than it tends to get in strike-by-strike coverage. Mojtaba Khamenei took over a country at war, with much of the prior leadership generation killed in the same opening strikes that killed his father, and with the economy already weakened by the sanctions that followed the 2025 war. A new leader consolidating power under those conditions faces pressure to demonstrate resolve that a more established leader might not. Hardline factions inside Iran have reportedly pushed back against diplomatic overtures throughout this year, and any Iranian leadership, new or old, negotiating an end to the war, has to do so while managing a domestic audience that includes officials and commanders who lost colleagues, superiors, and in some cases family members in the February strikes. That internal politics doesn't show up in a nightly CENTCOM statement, but it shapes what kind of deal Tehran can actually accept and survive politically, which in turn shapes